Good morning. Thank you all for being here. We will start in just a moment. Thank you all for being here. We will be starting in 30 seconds. Hello and good morning. I'm Dana Blum, the Senior Director for Common Sense here in the Bay Area. And we want to welcome all of our national premium member schools. You are watching this live today because your school is part of our premium membership. And these discussions we air for parents. And we hope that they're going to be helpful in dealing with a lot of the issues that you're dealing with today around the pandemic and with mental health and technology. Common Sense brings these discussions to you as a nonprofit. We are dedicated to ensuring that kids understand how to use technology wisely and to harness technology for good and the positive change that they can make in the world. So we are honored and thrilled to share the wisdom of these experts in the fields of mental health and research today. And I'd like to begin by introducing our moderator, Dr. Michael Robb. Dr. Robb is a Senior Director of Research here at Common Sense. We are thrilled to have him overseeing and moderating this discussion today. Dr. Robb oversees our research program, evaluation of the organizational impact, and the program development for research at Common Sense. He has been involved in issues involving media and children for over 15 years, and he has published research in a variety of academic journals on the impact of electronic media on our young children's language development, early literacy outcomes, and problem-solving abilities. Michael has also supervised community educational outreach efforts, helping parents and teachers make the most of quality children's programming. Also today, we are thrilled and excited to have two esteemed experts in the field of mental health, and both of them reside here in the Bay Area. First, we have Dr. Neha Chaudhary. Neha is a double board certified child and adolescent and adult psychiatrist at Harvard, freelance writer, and co-founder of the Stanford Brainstorm Lab. She has a telemedicine practice. Her work and advice have appeared in numerous publications, New York Times, Washington Post, Forbes, and Wired. She's been on CNN, ABC News, Good Morning America, and she is frequently featured on national panels and broadcasts. We also have her partner, Dr. Nina Vasan, who is an MBA, MD, psychiatrist, entrepreneur, and pioneer in mental health innovation. She is a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, where she is the founder and executive director of the Brainstorm Lab. I am going to turn it over right now to Dr. Michael Robb to begin this very interesting discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to let everyone know that we will be answering a few of your questions that you sent in at the end. We'll be posting them, and then Dr. Chaudhary and Dr. Vasan and Dr. Robb will answer them as the best they can. Lastly, I wanted to mention that Common Sense puts all of this information out for our Common Sense community and our parents free. We never have a paywall, and we are a nonprofit, and we are based here in San Francisco. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Robb.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you to our esteemed and very knowledgeable panelists who are joining us today. Thank you, Neha, and thank you, Nina. I'm going to start our discussion by just kind of giving a broad overview of some of the work that Common Sense has done in this area. It seems to me, and based on the work that we've done, that concerns about teens and tweens mental health and digital technology use was already high before 2020 introduced new and global challenges that will define this generation. Almost overnight, schools, peer networks, workplaces, and communities were pushed online. We saw record levels of unemployment and economies all over the world taking a painful hit that are only beginning to come back. And a review of both history and developmental science tells us that families with children are likely to be hit hardest by these types of economic downturns, and that the mental health and well-being of many children and youth are likely to suffer as a result. When we started our own work at Common Sense on this topic early this year, we did it through the lens of trying to better understand adolescents' mental health in the digital age. We assumed we were going to take a straightforward look at how social media and technology does and doesn't affect teen mental health, and testing assumptions that we often make about how digital technology use influences adolescents' mental health against findings that are generated using lots of different kinds of methodologies, from surveys to experiments, digital tracking. But obviously, events in the world pushed us to reframe our research and to try to do a much better job of looking at mental health in a broader context. So let me start by looking at what we know about teen mental health generally. In the months and years leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, adolescents, defined in our own report as young people between the ages of 10 all the way up to the age of 24, were reporting increased symptoms of depression, anxiety, and suicide risk. Rising depression and risk of suicide among adolescent girls, and girls of color in particular, were especially concerning. We also had to take in the broader economic realities for many children. In 2017, over 1 in 3 adolescents lived in a low-income household, which is defined as being less than twice the federal poverty line, and about 1 in 6 adolescents living below the federal poverty line, which in 2018 was defined as a family of 4 living on roughly $25,000 a year or less. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, these numbers are likely to increase as families with children are the hardest hit by economic downturns and also least likely to experience economic gains as the economy begins to recover. Now, the fact that so many adolescents are growing up in either poverty or in a low-income household is critical to consider, because household socioeconomic status is one of the best predictors we have of current and future mental health. Child poverty has a long reach and often carries effects that can be detected years and even decades later. Now, parents, educators, and mental health professionals were struggling to respond to these increases. Now the combination of a global pandemic, the economic downturn, the closure of schools for many students is placing additional pressures on the mental health of adolescents and the adults that are teaching, parenting, and supporting them. And as for the role of technology, it's a mixed bag. Parents certainly have a lot of fear that technology is driving depression, anxiety, and other health problems. But the best research that we have to date suggests that the claim that screen time and social media use is a cause of mental health outcomes is uncertain. Several large studies of young people have found correlations between heavy technology use and unhappiness, but correlation is not causation. It could be that unhappy people seek refuge online or use social media in more problematic ways. And the relationships that we do tend to find in the research so far are weak and offer no way to separate cause from effect. We do see that social media use is related to worse mental health more frequently, specifically among adolescent girls. But again, it could be a cause, it could be a symptom, or both. We don't have that many longitudinal studies to look at, but there is some new research that shows that for girls only, that early negative mental health symptoms predict later social media use patterns. But the reverse is not true. That is, that social media use does not predict later symptoms. And the research doesn't find anything for boys. We also see that offline risk often precedes and marks online risks. That is, if you're a young adolescent with existing mental health vulnerabilities, you're more likely to report more negative online experiences, and your patterns of social media use may potentially be more harmful. So it's a mixed, sometimes confusing bag of research, certainly needs a lot more work to be done, but I'm hoping we can address some of that in our conversation today. And with that, I'd like to turn over to the panel to discuss in more detail some of the concerns about adolescence and mental health. So Neha, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. What do we know about anxiety and depression or other mental health problems in adolescence? How often do they co-occur? How can parents recognize them?
This question's come up a lot recently from parents who are seeing their kids struggle with either new or worsening symptoms and aren't quite sure what to look for or when to worry. Now, there was a report that just came out through Mental Health America that really supports some of the data that you shared, One fact and figure that I thought was really striking is that from between January and September, they looked at reports from youth and also adults, and they showed that during the pandemic, youth ages 11 to 17 have been more likely than any other age group to score for moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety and depression on some of the rating scales. That's very much in line with a lot of the data that you showed. So now, what do we know about anxiety and depression, and then how do we think about it clinically? We use something called the biopsychosocial model when assessing for kids for the conditions in order to understand where they're coming from and then also what to do about it. And it really helps us think about the child not only in isolation, but in the context of who they are and what the world around them looks like. So biologically, we might think about things like what genes the child's working with, because we know that they might be genetically predisposed to some of these conditions. We think psychologically about things like their defense mechanisms or strengths that they have and how they approach the world. And socially, we think about things like who they have around to support them, what their living situation is like, because we know that essentially all of these things are important factors in the child's mental health. And now these are just some examples of what we consider, but it helps get to the bottom of clinically what's going on and how best to support the child. In terms of anxiety and depression and whether they coexist, they do often go hand in hand, but not always. That said, there are a lot of features between the two that do overlap. So generally what I tell parents is this: don't worry about making a diagnosis, leave that part to the professionals. But instead, there are some common signs and symptoms that you may want to keep an eye out for. So with adults, anxiety and depression might look like worry or restlessness or a low mood that adults are able to describe in words. But in kids, it can look a bit different. So some typical signs that something's wrong could be being very short-fused, being more sensitive or quicker to react, not sleeping much, restless nights of tossing and turning, not having much of an appetite. This one's really important. Younger kids may not report any of those symptoms and may not seem to have mood-related symptoms, but they could report having symptoms in their bodies, like headaches or stomach aches. So that's definitely something to look for. You also want to see if kids are pulling away from friends because they're preoccupied and restless around others, or just feeling like isolating, staying in their room a little bit more often. Older kids might even turn to substances. You might notice lower than usual self-esteem, crying more often, having angry outbursts. And of course, you really want to look for any safety concerns like thoughts of suicide, not wanting to be alive anymore, or thoughts of seriously hurting other people. The most important part here that I'll leave parents with is look for changes from your child's baseline. As a parent, if you have a gut feeling that something's off, it's likely time to seek out help from a professional. You don't have to do this alone.
And that's all really helpful information. And I think, so often think about the role of technology in kids' lives, and some of the things you just mentioned, I think dovetail with that in terms of like kids finding their own spaces or going to the rooms, and sometimes they're on technology, sometimes they're not. Why do you think adolescents are so attracted to technology and social media? What do you think is happening on a developmental level that makes them so appealing? And then how does that change from early adolescence through late adolescence? Because I can't imagine, or maybe it is, but I imagine there's some changes going on there as well.
I'm so happy you asked this, because there are many reasons for this. And a lot of parents have been asking this in my clinic as well. So the 4 reasons that come to mind that I typically do share with parents are these. First and foremost, teens are attracted to tech and social media because the platforms are not only engaging and fun to use, there's evidence to suggest that many of the features that some of these platforms have, and a lot of technology has, activates the same parts of the brain that are implicated in addiction. It may not necessarily be the same thing, but certain parts of the brain, the reward centers, light up. So to talk about this in a little bit slightly different terms, in human behavior terms, there's something called, quote unquote, variable ratio reinforcements. What does that mean? It means that when someone performs a certain behavior, like posting a picture or refreshing the screen to check on the picture, and they get a different type of response to that behavior each time, like the number of likes or comments that pop up. Sometimes they may get no response. Sometimes it's a small reward or a couple of likes. Sometimes it's a big reward, or when they refresh the page, they see a lot more likes roll in. In this type of reinforcement, the person learns to keep posting pictures or keep checking on pictures because it feels like a reward, and it's human nature to keep trying or keep repeating the behavior in hopes of getting that higher reward each time and seeing what they're going to get. It's those reward pathways in the brain that are implicated in addiction or addictive behaviors. Now, some of the companies are thinking about this and are rethinking the roles that various functions play. So I imagine we're going to see some of these functions evolve, and we already have started to see that a little bit. But meanwhile, for teens, part of the issue is that their brains are still developing. And you asked about earlier adolescence versus later adolescence. Brains are developing until age 25. And while emotions and impulses are running high, the part of their brain that's not fully formed yet is the frontal lobe, which is essentially putting the brakes or inhibiting or reining in the impulses and responsible for exercising judgment and critical thinking. So if that part's not fully formed, it makes sense that kids are going to have impulses towards what's engaging or new or shiny or rewarding. So that's number one. Number two, another factor that makes the technology and social media so attractive to teens is there's a lack of oversight right now. So teens are finding that they have a lot more freedom online and on these platforms. Think about it, with in-person communities, we have rules in schools, in churches, or on playgrounds even. Online, those rules are thrown out the window. And a lot of teens are finding enjoyment in this newfound sense of autonomy because that is something that teens start to crave. Number three, we're seeing a whole new set of dynamics online. People are connecting with people that they otherwise wouldn't have met. The connection's much more convenient. Remember how long it took to even get on the internet via dial-up, right? It was, maybe 30 minutes of that sound, that AOL sound, and then the phone rings and it's done. Now people are able to connect with others literally at their fingertips, and they're connecting at scale. They're connecting with a lot of people from potentially all over the world that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to contact. There's also a sense of anonymity. So some teens like that they're able to stay truly anonymous online. Others say that there's almost this sense that because it's through a screen, it's not real and it's a little bit removed. So that perceived sense of being removed from who you're interacting with is really important because it seems to have made teens feel fearless in a way that doesn't necessarily exist in person, because in person you have social cues or feedback, right? If you say something that's potentially mean, that person reacts. You get a direct consequence, and you don't necessarily get that as direct of a consequence in real time online as you do in person. So that fearlessness is fine when it helps somebody open up in a helpful way when otherwise they would have maybe been too shy or inhibited. But it can be really detrimental when it's a new sense of comfort in being mean. And honestly, some teens really like that they can have a powerful influence on others and see immediate responses from others. And the last big bucket that I have come across in some of my research is that images, and interestingly, a lot of platforms are formed around images. Images are particularly effective at evoking emotions. So there are studies that show that teens in particular have a stronger emotional response on adults in response to images, and more so than compared to reading text or a caption of a graphic. That emotional response can be enough to keep a teen coming back for more, irrespective of whether the feeling that they're experiencing in response is a positive one or a negative one, unfortunately.
If I could follow up real quickly with a question that's a little off our original topics here. So I'm struck by a couple of things that you said, but the one that catches me is, I think, developmentally about teens is we've had, consensus talked about teens and technology and addiction for a while. And one of the things that we heard from teens was that they say, I'm not addicted to technology, I'm addicted to my friends. Where do you think the kind of line is, or shared responsibility between a tech company who's designing something that's addictive versus teens' kind of normal developmental needs to just want to be validated by their peers and hang out with their friends?
Nina, do you want to take this?
Yeah, please. Oh, Nina, I think you're still muted.
Thank you. And I'll ask if you can repeat the question.
Well,
please.
I was talking about teens when we actually talk to them, ask about, they say, I'm not addicted to technology, I'm not addicted to social media, I'm addicted to my friends, right? And so I was asking, what is kind of the balance there between that, the problematic nature of like designing something that's meant to like grab you and kind of pull you in unnecessarily versus what teens want to do normally because they're teens, which is, be with friends and, be social and be validated by their peers.
Absolutely. So that's a fabulous question. And the way we think about it is when we think about social media use in general, it really is specific to how you're using social media. And even if we do things like set limits on the amount of time kids spend or which platforms we say are good or bad, there's so much nuance in what specifically they're doing. So, it is very true that for a lot of kids, this is one of the best ways for them to connect with other people. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, and I think about folks where, you might be from a small area or from a community that's underrepresented, and you might be able to connect with someone who's going through a shared experience. And that can be a really, really powerful experience for a kid to be able to have someone who understands you, who sees you, who hears you. And so when we look at social media, especially from the research perspective, we see that when kids are engaging in that pro-community type of way of trying to build connections with other people, we see many improvements in their mental health and well-being. We see rates of depression go down, sense of connectedness increase, and even skills around resilience improve. Now, on the flip side, so the issue here is, what are your friends doing? When you're addicted to your friends, are you, talking to them about their life or connecting over a shared thing that you love? Or is it connecting with friends or others, in your class around things that are more harmful? And I think that when we look at that breakdown around how you're using, that's what we need to just really be able to be perceptive about, and especially for parents to be able to talk to their kids about this. We're actually going to give some tips about that a little bit later on, how to best talk to your kids about these things. So what that is to say is it's important how, and in understanding what your kids are doing, being able to ask them a little bit more detail on what they're doing. And I think that can really help you almost triage, is this something we want to support? And is this helping my kids' health? Or is this something that we want to put some limits on?
Thank you. That's very helpful and insightful. And I just actually also wanted to go back to Dr. Chaudhary for a moment. Are there particular kids that you are concerned about when they go online, either concerned about or maybe hopeful for in terms of what they might experience when they go online? And are you seeing anything in your practice right now, specifically right now during COVID-19, with your teens that seems like either especially alarming or hopeful?
So I do think there's a lot of potential for positive interventions, tips, tools, ways to connect with other people online. In terms of who we should worry about, I think to some degree, we really should be worrying about all kids when they go online in terms of making sure that they're engaging in positive ways and not either harming others or being harmed by others. Kids, as we know, are much more vulnerable than adults, and we have safeguards. Until we have safeguards in place on the platforms, it's going to be really hard to decide who is and isn't more vulnerable than the next person to the potential negative effects of going online. In terms of what I'm seeing in my practice right now, however, I do see a lot of teens with anxiety and depression who are struggling with things like low self-esteem, poor body image, or what I call depression goggles, where they see the world through a negative lens. And a lot of these kids have reported feeling very shaken up by experiences that they have online, either with people bullying them or themselves comparing themselves to others. And I suspect that given the symptoms that they're dealing with and given what's often a difficulty coping with stressors for them, they're especially susceptible to some of these negative outside influences, many of which happen to be coming from the online world right now. So for those kids, I talk to them about examining their social media habits and the effects that it's having on them personally. Is this a positive experience for you? Is this a negative experience for you? What parts do you like? What parts do you not? I've also found that a lot of teens are finding it really hard to disconnect from their devices. Now, on the plus side, they're using their devices to stay connected in a time where it's really hard to connect. People are feeling very isolated. In that regard, I think it's a very positive thing. I think it becomes a problem when they want to disconnect more and or feel like it's contributing to their symptoms or they're not able to stay present throughout their day. Some people do say that that's the only connection that they have and the only outlet to express themselves. Others say it's the only stimulation that they're able to get, and otherwise they're overcome with boredom. But what I found is that for the kids in the bucket where they feel like they're using it too much, that excessive online use might be a symptom of something deeper. It could be a coping mechanism for underlying symptoms of anxiety or depression, or even just a lot of worry or stress. So that might be something to look for in kids where you're worried about they're using the social media or going online much more than you'd expect for the new remote learning environment, or who are going online much more than they want to be going online. Is there something else going on?
Dr. Vasan, what do you think technology can do to address the mental health problems of teens? Does technology even have a role in helping to support teens' mental health? And could you talk about what you refer to as the contagion effect?
Absolutely. The answer is a lot. And one of the things that we think is most exciting about technology is that when we think about the power of technology, certainly it's done a lot to get kids addicted and, be this product that they really enjoy using. And there are a lot of detrimental effects, which I'll touch upon in just a bit. But at the same time, the very power that makes, millions of people sign up for these products and spend billions of hours a day probably on them, that is a very powerful force. And when companies can understand how to best leverage those same forces for good, there's an enormous potential. So I'll tell you about some work that we've done and how we think about the pros and cons of social media overall. So we work at a lab, Stanford Brainstorm, and we're lucky to be right here in the middle of Silicon Valley, where folks who are building and designing these companies are all around us. And one of the things I think I've seen, especially as a psychiatrist and as a doctor who's coming from the medical perspective, is the people who are building these products and platforms really do want to do good. They have kids themselves and they're worried about their kids, and they want to make sure that the product is going to be overall healthy and safe for their users. And so when we think about that, we think, okay, so we know that there are negative things, we know that there are positive things. What should social media companies be doing? And then moreover, how should you as parents be thinking about what areas of this are appropriate and what do you want to shield your kids from? So we put together a framework, and I think actually Common Sense will share, we have a Wired article in which we publish this framework. And we split it out into two big areas. The first area, and this is specifically how social media companies should be thinking about their users, especially when they're teens. So the first area is do no harm. Now, this is the oath that we take as physicians to our patients, that we want to make sure that of everything we do, we need to really protect them first and make sure that no action we take is going to add any negativity to their life. And so from the social media perspective, what this means is that first, to not allow teens to be harmed by what they consume. And then secondly, to not allow teens to harm others by what they create. And we break that down because when we look at patterns of social media use, we often see that that distinction between consumption and creation has a really big impact on the way that teens are using social media and the mental health impact that it has. Now, the third element of that is that we think about safety first. And so ultimately, if there is any concern for high risk, now this could be something like if there's a teen who's expressing thoughts of self-harm or suicide, expressing wanting to harm oneself or harm others, that this is really identified on the platform and that the platform immediately takes action when we think about legal, ethical, and cultural norms, and takes action to pass it along to the experts. We view this as a key obligation for social media companies to make in order to keep teens and all users safe. So that's the do no harm part. So the next part we have is do good. And as I was saying earlier, certainly there has been harm that's been done, but when we utilize those patterns and behaviors to leverage it into something good, there's enormous potential here. When we think about where everyone is spending their day, there's so many hours that people are spending online. We really think of online as being the new community. And, when we think of, to refer to Dr. Chaudhary's example of the olden days when we had dial-up AOL, you also were going outside and playing with kids down the street. And now, especially during coronavirus, those same experiences that previous generations might have had outside of the house are being done inside of the house and online. And so when we think about the opportunities to think of online as this community and this space where people are living their lives, it gives us the opportunity to do some really good things. So within our framework, the way we think about it is that the opportunities to do good are threefold. One, to help teens get help on the platform. So that means creating products on the platform where in the platform itself or easily through other things online, they can get help. They can reach out to experts, they can do even exercises and activities themselves, they can learn new content that really helps them do everything from understanding themselves better, understanding if they're at risk, and then actually having something in real time to do about it. And we think that real time element is especially important. So one is making sure that teens have the ability to get help on the platform. The second element is, especially coming from us as physicians, why we think this is important, making sure to get help off the platform. Ultimately, being able to know when to talk to your parent, when to go to a doctor like us, when to talk to your teachers. These are the really important things that help not only in the moment, but also lead to long-term safety and better mental health. And so we want to really make sure that those two elements are focused on. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this framework is that I think that when we're assessing either individual platforms or your own teen's use, trying to think through where those different points come up is really important. You want to protect your kid from anything that could be harmful. And you also want to see how can social media be best leveraged to do something good. So now that I've explained the platform, the next thing that I want to do is actually give you a specific example of both. Yep.
No, please.
Oh, okay.
That would be my next question.
Fantastic. So what I want to be able to do is give you a specific example of what we saw and really how does mental health play out on social media and then what we tried to do to improve it. Now, when you were asking this question, Mike, I think one thing that's really important to understand is that social media has both led to decreases and really serious patterns of seeing worsening mental health, as common sense has shown. We see at times worsening depression, self-image, even thoughts of self-harm. The more time teens are exposed to different social media sites. Yet at the same time, we know that there's so many elements, like I mentioned community before, as being able to make people feel better, giving them hope, education. I think the opportunity for education is really one of the biggest things that we can get online that we're not necessarily getting in schools, for example. So what did we see? So the organization, the company that we worked with was Pinterest. And I have to start off by saying that, we did work with Pinterest and we always give financial disclosures in the world of medicine. So, we did consult with Pinterest and want to give that as a disclosure. And all that said, one of the things that I was most impressed with Pinterest about in getting to work with their leadership team was the real depth of their commitment to improving the mental health of their users and really thinking about kids and teens. In particular, when we were working with them, things that we think about in sort of like the skeptical, like, okay, this is a business at the end of the day, meaning things like ad revenue or user acquisition or user retention, they were 100% clear on the business part was not at all what they wanted to focus on. And they really wanted to think very genuinely about what they could do to create good things for the users, everything else aside. And I say that because, there is a lot already out there about all the social media companies and a lot of, negative as well as kind of criticism that they rightfully do have. And I think it's important to see that there's good coming and good that has been created and will continue to be created. So to explain a little bit about what we did with Pinterest. Now, folks currently, for those of you who have probably used Pinterest, the most common ways that people tend to use it are things like wedding planning or interior design, or maybe creating mood boards to help you figure out your exercise regimen or really healthy recipes. So those are like a lot of the common ways that people use Pinterest. Now, what was really fascinating is that when the Pinterest team looked at the search results and tried to understand the queries of what are people looking for when they come to our platform, it turned out that mental health related searches, that is things like depression or stress or how do I deal with a breakup, were actually one of the most popular categories. In fact, the fourth most common category of search terms. And when they saw that, they were really struck because this was a lot more popular than they expected. When you think about where are you going to go online to find mental health help, Pinterest is not the place that most people would think about. And so what this shows us is that there's an enormous, enormous need and interest for users to go online and try to find these things. And even places that we wouldn't even think they would go, they're actually doing so in like masses. And so what they wanted to do, the way Pinterest was before was when someone would then search for something like depression, like stress, they would get a number of pictures with everything from, like the top 10 tips on depression or depression music or pictures that make people feel better and some really, interesting things that they can do. But what Pinterest wanted to do is think about when we know the science and the medicine behind what helps people when they are depressed or when they are anxious, how do we actually present that to them? And so what they did is called what we call compassionate search. This has a few different elements to it. One is if we think about, okay, compassionate search, how do we create a search experience for teens such that it feels safe and okay to talk about their mental health, to be searching for mental health? And then when they do finally search for something, that they receive things that make them feel seen and heard and give them the actual tools that they need. So the same sorts of things that Dr. Chaudhary and I would do with our patients in clinic, how do we actually transfer that to something that people can do online when they are letting us know that they're feeling depressed or looking for something around a breakup? So what this compassionate search tool did is it actually used the same treatments, the same scientifically validated treatments that we would do with patients. And we turned it into these very simple and easy exercises, everything from like 1 to 5 minutes that you can do online. So now if you go into Pinterest on the website, on the app, and you type in these terms, you actually get a new pop-up with a whole list of different activities that you can do in real time and actually improve your mental health. So things like how to understand your mood or put yourself in someone else's shoes, or even do a few minutes of a mindfulness exercise that we know decreases stress and makes people feel better. So that's the one big part. The final thing I want to talk about is that this part that it's what we call micro treatments. So how do we actually deliver treatments online in a way that is effective for people? The second part that we did is what we call micro interventions. And that's where we actually tried to change the platform itself to create a better and safer experience. Now, where this came from was there had been a story in the news about over a year ago where there was a teen in the UK who had been searching for very harmful content around suicide and cutting. And she had looked on pictures both on Instagram and on Pinterest around this topic, a very dark topic. And what Pinterest realized in the aftermath of this tragedy was that they absolutely have to change the experience so something like this would never happen. And so the changes that we made to the platform were multiple fold. And what we were trying to think about is if you're coming to the platform in this mindset, what do we do to help you both feel heard, but also be safe and have all the protective mechanisms we can put in to prevent anything from getting worse? So what that starts with was, if you think, for example, on Google, if you go to Google and start to type something, a lot of the times there's autofill, as it's predicting what you might be typing and then suggesting something for you. What we were able to do is change it so that when someone is typing something negative, it's not actually then autofilling and giving you the opportunity to actually stop and think about what you're typing. The next thing that we did is we actually worked with the engineers and changed the algorithms such that now when people look for this sort of content, the experience they have is very different. So instead of getting bombarded by more and more negative images, you're both provided with the opportunity to seek help, both on and off the platform, as we talked about, as well as then not having this like doom scrolling like effect, which is one of the things that when we talk to kids, they mention and they identify themselves as, this is one of the worst parts. I search for something and then I get, 100 more of the same thing. How do I get out of it? It's so hard. And what we know about our brains is that our brains are more primed to both identify and remember negative content over positive content. So what we did is we changed the algorithms, and now actually literally within a few months, they saw an 88% decrease in self-harm searches. So that's the overview I wanted to give. And I know we have a lot to talk about, so we'll go on to the next question. But the big takeaway there is that there's so much good that can happen. There's so much risk. Companies are already doing a good job of trying to address the risk with everything like bullying, self-harm, and putting good mechanisms into place. The biggest opportunity that we think there is to do good and identify ways that your kids can be engaging really safely and positively with these platforms.
That's great. First of all, I love the term compassionate search. I love that there's an appetite out there for some tech companies to be incorporating suggestions from doctors and health professionals about how they can maximize the mental health of kids just through their everyday interactions with the technology. I think that's so smart. I'd like to turn this over for a minute to talk a little bit more about what parents can be doing. And Dr. Chaudhary, you write about the impact and importance of rituals. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means and why it's important for adolescents and their families?
I would love to. I love talking about rituals. I'm going to just share a little personal tidbit. My spouse and I have Mexican food every Friday, at least every Friday that we can. And one thing that I found is with that first bite of food, it's not just about the food. It's not even just about getting to be present and spend time together. It marks that the week is over and the weekend's here, despite potentially being in the exact same place in our apartment. It means something more to us. It means that we can let ourselves unwind, let our guards down, accept what we have versus haven't accomplished that week, and then really switch gears to time to nurture ourselves. And it's that meaning behind a ritual that is really important. And that's a really important distinction between rituals and routines. Routines are something that we do because of the functionality, because of what it accomplishes, whereas rituals are something that we do purely because of the meaning that we ascribe to it. And the science has shown that when you do something that means something to you, it makes you feel good. And these are the types of positive feelings and experiences that we need right now to balance out all of the negative stuff going on. Kids especially need to feel that balance and need to feel warmth and love and kindness in the middle of all of the worry and all of the changes. So these are things that are really simple to do, and we can use them proactively in our everyday lives as a way to feel in charge of our world before it takes charge of us. So in this article, I interviewed a couple of athletes, including basketball player Kevin Love and figure skater Brady Tennell. And the reason that I spoke to them is athletes focus so much of their careers on getting not only their bodies, but also their minds into a good spot before performances or games. They focus on how to prepare for the unknown because they don't know what's going to happen once they get out onto the court or the field or onto the ice. So I talked to them about the types of supports that they have in place, both for their physical wellness, but then also their mental wellness. And athletes are known for having pre-game rituals. The cool thing is there's a science behind it. There was a study that made people perform a ritual and ascribe some sort of meaning to it and do it over and over again before singing in public or taking a math test. And it turns out that both groups did better if they did the ritual first. Now, one of the theories behind this is that rituals engage parts of the brain that put the brakes on some of the emotion centers and help us find instead focus and calm. Another theory is that the familiarity and the meaning makes us feel good. And anytime you release those feel-good chemicals in your brain, you're typically enhancing your ability to think clearly and better. So some things that I suggest that parents try at home with their kids. You could, if you're embarking on a stressful car ride, or if you know that the morning routine is chaotic, if you build in a simple ritual of, say, having kids shake their limbs out in a silly dance together with you when you play music for a minute, that can help kind of add some calm and focus. One thing that Kevin Love talked about was he has a playlist that he listens to as part of his 90-minute pre-game ritual, and he calls his playlist, quote unquote, airplane mode. So one suggestion for parents is to help kids create their own airplane mode where they mindfully listen to music or color or breathe deeply like Darth Vader. And that could be something that the whole family does. Like, let's go into airplane mode on Saturday mornings. And what does our airplane mode look like? Some other rituals that have been helpful that people have liked is listing gratitudes in the morning or evening, reading before bed, even praying. Basically, just that consistency creates something to look forward to, and then something that kids and parents can feel a sense of ownership over. And lastly, eating meals together and any sort of family rituals can really help with cohesion within the family unit and also even marital cohesion between parents.
I mean, that's great. It resonates a lot with my own experience where we do family movie night every Friday, and it's just an important and fun thing that we all do together. It's not functional, but it's fun, and it gives, you know, a special time. Can we talk a little bit about what parents can do to help themselves right now and to help their families? I mean, parents are also under a lot of stress, and there's some shared responsibility, I think, between parents and their teens about what they, both in terms of what they do online and also in terms of taking care of their own mental health. How do you talk to parents of kids in your practice, and why is this important?
Definitely. I tell parents that if they want to take good care of their kids, they have to take good care of themselves, because otherwise there just isn't enough reserve energy to pour towards your children. And kids pick up on your distress, they internalize it. Your anxiety, your fears, your worries can really spill over to kids. So the better you're able to manage those things, the better you can keep them from affecting your kids negatively. So I'm going to share 3 big buckets of things that I recommend parents do to take care of themselves, because I think these are really important. The first one is let yourself be a good enough parent and reduce your mental load. What does this mean? It means let yourself say, it's okay for me not to be perfect at work and at home. In fact, if you have figured out how to do that and be perfect in both of those places, please share with the rest of us here today. What you want to do is let yourself off the hook. Let yourself be good enough and cover what absolutely needs to be covered. Is there food on the table? Are the urgent work tasks complete? Is everybody safe? Reconsider where that bar is that you set for yourself and recognize when and where you're expecting too much. Because essentially, if your bar is in the same spot as it was pre-COVID, you're only going to let yourself down and feel like you've failed, because there have been huge shifts that have occurred, and that bar of what you expect for yourself has to shift with it. We all need wins right now, honestly. So let's set ourselves up for one. In terms of reducing your mental load, what do I mean by that? We're usually very concerned with to-dos and splitting up or reducing actions, but not so good at splitting up mental loads. That means all the things that you're carrying in your head, all the decisions to be made, all the things about how does homework get done, how do we stay safe, whether grandma can visit, whether we can hug. All of those things are a lot to carry, and that load, especially if you are considering splitting it up with a partner or across the family, it may not be split up in a fair or sustainable way. So have a chat with your partner, have a chat with your family members to split up some of the more action-oriented to-dos, but then also those mentally heavy tasks or considerations. If you're a single parent or have a different family structure, you can still split it up with yourself by distributing that load across the week or whatever time frame you're working with. Allow yourself to mentally tackle any 1 or 2 things on a given day of the week and leave the other topics for the other day, because they're likely not going anywhere. And if you carry all of those things every single day, that's a lot. The next big thing you want to do, next number 2 big bucket, is check in with how you're feeling and work to manage your own emotions. Because as we said, the more you learn to identify how you're feeling, the more you'll teach your kids emotional literacy, the more they'll model after you, and the more you'll keep yourselves and your emotions from affecting them in a negative way. Once you've identified your feelings, there's a lot of things that you can do to help you cope better in the moment. The ones that I like to share, there's 2 that are natural antidepressants. One is music, and the second one is exercise. If you pair these with things like deep breathing exercises or mindfulness meditation, all of these things have evidence behind them, and you're bound to start seeing small differences in your moment-to-moment ability to handle the tough emotions as they come, and you'll model being able to navigate big feelings for your kids. They'll just passively pick up on what you're doing and start internalizing that. So you'll be helping not only yourself manage feelings, but helping your kids learn how to manage their feelings. Again, the better that you can do it, the more your kids will know how to do it too, and that'll stay with them when they're adults. The third big bucket is to get really good at setting boundaries, schedules, and making routines. Why? Because these are like swaddles for the mind. They're comforting. They reduce some of that mental load that we just talked about, because Things get removed from your brain's plate and they get placed on a calendar. Boundaries is one of the things that's harder for most, and one thing that people are really struggling with right now. A lot of it's learning to say no, not doing things that you otherwise do for others without any thought in order to preserve your own peace of mind or your energy reserves. Stopping working at a certain time to preserve that quality family time when there are no work-life boundaries right now. And then having schedules can help assuage anxieties and worries, because you can make those in advance so that in the moment, there's less decisions to be made and there's more executing against the decisions you've already made. Same with routines. As things become a habit, they become easier. They also become familiar, and that makes them comforting. And we all need comfort right now.
That's great. And by the way, the term swaddle for your mind, I think released some of those pleasure-producing chemicals in my brain. I really like that.
It feels so nice.
Right? Yeah, one hug. So I'm cognizant of the time here. I wanted to make sure, we had a lot of interesting questions from our viewers who are watching this, and I want to make sure we had time for one. So I think one's about to come up on the screen. Our kids feel isolated and rely on us for virtually everything. How do we create a sense of freedom and independence in the current context? Dr. Vasan, maybe I'll start with you.
Absolutely. So the first thing that I wanted to do before we go is I wanted to really be able to share with parents a very practical plan for how to address this. Because when it comes to youth and social media, there's such an overwhelming sense a lot of times. And it seems like this black box in terms of what are my kids doing. So what I wanted to do is give this recommendation. And specifically, when we think about responsibility, whose responsibility is it? Is it the company's responsibility, the parents, the kids? Ultimately, I think what was really helpful is for parents and kids to come together to create a personalized action plan around how they're going to actually use social media. Now, a few things that are really important. One is that this is going to be different for every kid, right? Every kid, depending on their age, depending on their sense of like what they're doing online, how they're spending time online, what their own needs are and their own developmental stage, just like Dr. Chaudhary talked about, every kid's going to need something different. So I think that this is a really good opportunity to focus on communication and working together where parents and kids can talk about everything on the platforms, right? How long you're going to spend, when during the day or during the week you're going to spend time online, what you're going to use it for. And in particular, how are they going to let their parents or other trusted adults know if something is happening online? What's that actual process going to look like? The reason why this is really important in terms of creating a personalized action plan is that, one, it gets you to have those like really tough sometimes conversations with your kids. And secondly, the planning, then when something tough does happen, it can be really scary for kids, right? Like if something's happening and if they don't know what's going on, they don't know who to talk about. So having this plan in place gives them a really easy and concrete thing to do to follow up. It also gives you as the parent a great chance to then intervene if you might be worried. And so what I recommend to everyone to do is discuss scenarios with them of what are you worried about, right? Like if you think about why you came to Common Sense, why you came to join this conversation today, there are probably some things that you're worried about that might happen to your kids. And if you can help them think through these different scenarios and how they would respond, that lets you problem solve together, lets you share some ideas, have them share some ideas, and then really come together to understand what's working. There are three areas that I think about as being a way to kind of frame this type of a discussion. And it's from Do Good Well, the book that I wrote that you'll find in the resources section. And there are three things. Number one, do what works. What that means is let's look at what's effective and what the research has shown us is helpful, both from the research perspective, which you can go to Common Sense for. But then secondly, this means actually testing out what's right for each kid. Some things are not going to work. And so almost like a science experiment, right? You can hypothesize how they might react, what you want to do, and then test it out and be kind of reiterating on this as you're proceeding. So number one, do what works. Number two, work together. So that's really all about communication and partnerships, being on the same team, talking often and regularly, and just making sure that you feel like you're on the same page and communicating that in a way that your team's going to understand. And then finally, make it last. Longevity, sustainability. You know, what's really important as we think about these platforms is that they're always changing, right? They have new features coming out every day. And moreover, there are new platforms that just came up. I mean, literally 2 years ago, no one was on TikTok. And now it's taken over, you know, pretty much the whole generation in terms of how they're able to express themselves, communicate, expose themselves to new content. And so these platforms are always going to be changing in a very dynamic way. So being able to continuously make this a part of your culture and the habits that you as a family have will allow you to make this a permanent part of your life. And this allows you to enter other conversations, everything from online to, you know, different things that are going on in your kid's life. So do what works, work together, make it last.
That's great. We are almost out of time. I think we have about time for, I think we're out of time. I do want to thank you both so much. Thank you to Dr. Neha Chaudhary and Dr. Nina Vasan. Your expertise here has been really illuminating and I hope helpful to the parents here. I know we have resources that we're going to be distributing either through email or that we'll have available after this conversation, because this really was a really rich conversation. We could go on probably for another couple of hours if we wanted to. But I thank you very much. I also remind people to check out the resources on Common Sense. We have lots of great, both ratings for good content for kids of different ages, but also lots of advice about how to deal with social media, how to handle TikTok, how to handle Instagram, how to handle all the various platforms that are out there. But that's at commonsense.org. And again, I really hope everybody enjoyed this conversation. It was really just a pleasure to have you both with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us. This was a pleasure. And feel free to reach out to us, everyone online, stanfordbrainstorm.com. You can reach out to us and we'd love to talk to you, your organizations, your kids, all of the above.
Thank you.